Hey, wonderful every day here. On the 11th of April, 1880, legendary U.S. Army General William T. Sherman stood in front of 10,000 graduates from the Michigan Military Academy and dotted three short words: "War is hell, rarely before all sins," has such a complex subject, being summarized so succinctly: the death and destruction, the flying bullets and exploding shells, the screams of the dying, and the silence of the dead. Hell is the only way to describe it in his 14th century epic poem, The Divine Comedy. Dante Alighieri imagined the underworld as a vast pit made up of 9 concentric rings. The DPU traveled into this spiral of damnation, the worst things would get if war is indeed hell, and we take Dante's doom spiral as our model of it. Then, the Battle of Ramree Island belongs in the underworld 9th and most nightmarish circle, sometimes called the Ramree Massacre. For reasons that will soon become clear, the Battle of Ramree Island was a relatively small engagement that took place towards the tail end of the Burma campaign in the final year of World War II. In total, under 1,000 soldiers lost their lives. Small potatoes by the horrifying standards of the Second World War, but it wasn't the volume of death that made this particular battle so terrifying. It was the cause, because the soldiers on Ramree Island weren't killed by bullets, bombs, and bayonets. They were slaughtered in their hundreds by giant man-eating reptiles. This is the horrifying story of the Ramree Crocodile Massacre, the single deadliest animal attack on humans in recorded history. But stick around to the end, because this one comes with a twist before the tan now. Outbreak of the Second World War. Burma, now officially known as Myanmar, was part of the British Empire, but the British were driven out by the Japanese in 1942 at the start of the Burma campaign. 3 years later, the war was almost over, and with Japanese forces suffering heavy losses across the entire Pacific theater, the Allies began wresting back control of the former British colony. The first step would be to retake the capital Rangoon as part of Operation Dracula. But to do that, the Allies were going to need somewhere to base their vital air support. Ramree Island was chosen as the perfect spot, just 200 miles from Rangoon. It had plenty of open land, suitable for airstrips that could be supplied by the deep-water ports on the island's northern tip. Right from the very start, the Battle of Ramree Island was a one-sided affair. The Japanese defenders were outnumbered 6-1, and with the Allies able to call on devastating naval and air support at will, they were outgunned by an even wider margin. The initial assaults, dubbed Operation Matador, kicked off on the 14th of January, 1945. with an amphibious landing on Ramree's pristine northern beaches. Royal Navy reconnaissance plant had spotted Japanese soldiers installing artillery in caves along the shore in preparation for the imminent invasion, so the British Navy sent the Dreadnought-class battleship HMS Queen Elizabeth, supported by dozens of smaller ships and the variety of air supports, to rain down fiery death and prepare the way for landing. By the time the sun had settled, the Allies were able to stroll onto the island entirely unopposed. It was almost like a summer holiday, except everything was on fire. By the following day, the port had been captured, and the Allies began to work their way south. Resistance was significantly fierce, or further inland, where 1,000 Japanese troops fought like tigers over every inch of ground. Given both as the Allies solely spread out across the island, it became clear resistance was futile. Ramree was lost. At this point, the Japanese general Kenichi Nagazera had a decision to make. Most military leaders would simply have waved the white flag. But by this point in the war, the Japanese had made it abundantly clear they would rather die than suffer the shame of surrender. In this case, however, there was a third option: escape. If Nagasawa and his men were somehow able to make it to the mainland, they'd be able to join up with the bulk of the Japanese army's remaining forces. There is just one small problem with this plan between Nagazara and the safety of the mainland was a vast mangrove swamp, a near impenetrable maze of trees which was either covered in thick oozing mud or waist-high water depending on the tide. This hellish labyrinth was infested with tropical disease-carrying mosquitoes, poisonous scorpions and spiders, and most ominously of all, massive saltwater crocodiles. All in all, it didn't sound great, but on the plus side, the mangrove swamp was so thick that the Japanese troops would be all but invisible, both from the ground and air, and it was so dangerous that the Allies surely wouldn't dare to follow them inside. In early February, the Japanese abandoned their fortified positions on the island and ventured into the swamp most would never. Make his house alive. Saltwater crocodiles are ambush hunters. They wait motionless for hours on end, and despite their bulk, they can make themselves practically invisible in just a few feet of water if something tasty looking gets too close. They explode into action, clamping down on their prey with a biting force of 3,700 pounds per square inch. That's about 4 times more powerful than a lion. Once they've latched on saltwater, crocodiles execute their mortal combat finishing move, the death roll, tearing whatever is in their mouth to bloody shreds. The Japanese soldiers on Ramree entered the mangrove swamp in a pretty bad condition. They'd been fighting non-stop for several weeks, and many were ill or injured. In hindsight, they never stood a chalice against what was waiting for them. The crocodiles mostly hunt at night, and as the soldiers ventured through the jungle, they were picked off one by one. It's hard to imagine just how terrifying that must have been. One moment you're carefully picking your way through the swamp by moonlight, and the next, something huge shifts in the darkness, and you're being dragged beneath the chilling waves by a creature big enough to, quite literally, swallow you whole. Some of those who were there to witness this horror firsthand have written accounts of what they saw. Amongst them was accomplished naturalist Bruce Wright, a lieutenant commander in the Royal Canadian Navy. He recorded his description of the crocodile massacre in his 1962 book, Wildlife Sketches. Near and far, it made for an incredibly chilling read. That night was the most horrible at any member of the motor launch. Crews ever experienced the scattered rifle shots in the pitch-black swamp, punctured by the screams of wounded men crushed at the jaws of huge reptiles, and the blurred, worrying sound of spinning crocodiles made a cacophony of hell that has rarely been duplicated on Earth. At dawn, the vultures arrived to clean up what the crocodiles had left of about 1,000 Japanese soldiers that entered the swamps of Ramree. Only about 20 were found alive. Wright's account is an accurate summary of how the story has been told ever since. You can find it in countless reference books, documentaries, YouTube videos, and podcasts for several decades. The Battle of Ramree Island was even featured in the Guinness Book of Records as the animal attack with the most human fatalities in history. The gruesome tale can really be true. After all, it does sound more like something you'd see in a movie theater rather than the theater of war. So what really happened on Memory Island 80 years ago? Let's start by looking at the villains of the piece, the crocodiles. Saltwater crocs are the largest reptiles on Earth. That's pretty common knowledge, but most people have no idea just how absurdly enormous these beasts can get if left to their own devices. Far from human interference, they can reach a staggering 7 meters in length and weighs on 2,000 kilograms. In other words, this is an animal that's significantly longer than a giraffe is tall and about the weight of 4 large grizzly bears combined. Thanks to their incredible size, combined with their natural aggression and a surprising level of intelligence, these literal cold-blooded killers are the undisputed apex predators of any ecosystem they find themselves in. They are quite simply one of the most dangerous animals on the planet. You may have seen footage of people swimming with sharks, but nobody gets into the water with a fully grown saltwater crocodile. So yes, given the opportunity, the crocodiles on Ramree Island would absolutely have killed any soldiers who got too close. But here's the thing. According to the most commonly told version of the story, around 900 men were killed by crocodiles in just a few days. Trouble is, that kind of crocodilian carnage could only have been possible if the swamp was teeming with thousands of extremely large saltwater crocs, and yet there's neither the food nor the space to support such a high density of mature adults in the Ramree mangrove swamp. Put simply, The legendary tale of the Ramree Crocodile Massacre is an ecological impossibility, a military myth born out of a decades-long game of Chinese whispers, combined with a straightforward misunderstanding many people have written about the massacre over the years. But Bruce Wright's account is the primary source that most people have drawn on. That makes sense, right? Wasn't just a soldier serving in the area at the time. He was a respected naturalist who knew what he was talking about when it came to crocodiles, or at least people thought. But in 2001, her pathologist and Ramree Massacre skeptic Stephen Platt noticed something interesting about Wright's account. Almost every wildlife anecdote in the entire book in which it appears is written from Wright's own perspective, but the chilling tale of the Crocodile Massacre is written in the third person. About Wright's account, he never actually explicitly stated that all the soldiers were killed by crocodiles, only that 1,000 soldiers entered the swamp and just 20 came out alive. As we've already seen, there were plenty of other dangers waiting for the Japanese amongst the mangroves, including tropical diseases and a variety of poisonous, creepy crawlies. Probably even more deadly were the conditions themselves, the sucking mud that would have sapped already weak soldiers' strength, the lack of food, and the brackish water that wasn't safe to drink. Not to mention the Allied soldiers patrolling the swamps scattered open waterways in boats who would likely have shot anyone came across music. The general consensus amongst historians is that most of the 500 poor souls who died lost their lives either to drowning or the guns of the Allies with crocodiles, mostly just scavenging the corpses when they got the chance. Truth is, well, you never know the real numbers, like Bruce Wright, who started all this trouble in the first place. We weren't there. Most of those who were are no longer with us. And even if they were, exactly what happened on the cover of those mangrove trees is inherently unknowable. Those on the outside couldn't see in, and those who perished took their secrets to their watery graves. Thanks for watching.